time, thousands of men engaged on this field in a desperate struggle. It was a carnival of death and suffering, the ground drenched in human blood. Ezra Carmen commanded over 600 soldiers from New Jersey at the Battle of Antietam. Decades later, as he walked these now tranquil fields and empty roads, the struggle, the violence, and the scars of that fateful September day remained fresh in his mind. What kind of men were these soldiers who died? They were Americans from all walks of life, the very best of the country. For Carmen and countless others, it was a country torn between North and South, freedom and slavery, hope and despair. At Antietam, the United States would suffer the single bloodiest day in its history and face a crucial moment in its struggle for survival.
Remembering Antietam.
April 1861. Confederate forces attacked the garrison inside Fort Sumter, a federal fortification in South Carolina, plunging the United States into civil war. The fighting was fierce, and by the summer of 1862, 11 southern states had seceded from the Union. For the United States and President Lincoln, it was a war to preserve the Union. For the Confederacy and white Southerners like Henry Benning, who would fight at Antietam, it was a war inseparable from slavery. Benning wrote, "Separation from the North was the only thing that could prevent the abolition of slavery." In 1862, attitudes in the North began to shift towards supporting freedom for those who were enslaved. And by that summer, Abraham Lincoln had drafted a proclamation of emancipation. But Lincoln did not issue it immediately. He needed to wait until federal troops secured a victory on the battlefield. For the United States, the war was going badly that summer of 1862. In General Robert E. Lee's first 3 months as commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, he blocked a federal advance on Richmond, then won a decisive victory at the Battle of Second Manassas. These Confederate successes, along with their advances in the West, worried President Lincoln. And now, France and Great Britain signaled that they might even recognize the Confederacy as an independent nation. That act could bring an end to the Civil War and a permanent split between North and South. The lack of positive news from the battlefield caused both civilians and soldiers in the North to grow increasingly despondent. A desperate Lincoln turned to General George Brenton McClellan to revitalize the Army of the Potomac. Morale was high among the Confederate troops, and though supplies were limited, General Lee made a risky decision. For the first time in the Eastern Theater, the Confederacy would invade the North. On September 4th, the Confederate Army began crossing the Potomac River into Maryland, a slaveholding border state that remained in the Union. The Maryland Campaign had begun. A victory could possibly win the war and divide the United States forever. McClellan quickly reorganized the Army of the Potomac. Within days, they marched out of Washington, D.C. to confront the Confederate invaders. Lee divided his army. He sent General Stonewall Jackson to capture the federal garrison at Harper's Ferry.
Yeah.
The main body of Lee's army in Maryland was exposed. McClellan went on the attack. On September 14th, in an all-day battle at South Mountain, Federal forces drove Lee's troops out of 3 mountain passes. 7 miles to the west, residents of Sharpsburg heard cannons booming as they attended Sunday morning church services. That afternoon, Confederate forces began to descend upon the town. Teresa Kretzer, the daughter of the local blacksmith and a Union supporter, lived on Main Street.
The rebel cavalry came dashing through the town, and the children ran home from church in terror.
While Teresa and her family stayed, many others fled. On the morning of September 15th, Stonewall Jackson took Harper's Ferry and captured 12,000 Federal troops. Lee then ordered Jackson and his men to return to Sharpsburg, creating a combined force of some 40,000. Having secured South Mountain, McClellan began to position his force of approximately 60,000 troops near Sharpsburg along Antietam Creek. McClellan's plan was to attack the Confederate left and right flanks, then smash through the center of Lee's line. As troops on both sides made preparations throughout the day on the 16th, everyone knew what was coming. Minnie Bettinger, a local girl, watched in anticipation as the townspeople panicked in the streets.
Whispers of a great battle to be fought the next day grew louder, and we shuddered at the prospect of blood, wounds, and death.
General Joseph Hooker, whose forces would lead the Federal assault, knew very well what was coming.
We are through for today, gentlemen. Tomorrow, we fight the battle that will decide the fate of the Republic.
Soldiers in the ranks knew it too.
Each army was preparing for the deadly struggle that the lowest private knew was to take place. We were prepared for what was to come.
There was skirmishing throughout the night.
The constant firing of the pickets kept us from sleeping, but at the break of day, everything became as still as death. It was only the calm that preceded a terrible storm.
We were astir at the first streak of dawn. All realized that there was ugly business and plenty of it just ahead.
We could see the first rays of the sun lighting up the distant hilltops, when there was a sudden flash from the enemy's artillery.
With these shots, the Battle of Antietam had begun. Advancing Federal troops moved through a field of tall corn.
As our line appeared at the edge of the corn, a long line of men in butternut and gray rose up from the ground.
We saw the black-hatted Yanks coming on, and at the command fired, a rolling volley blasted forth.
Rifles are shot to pieces in the hands of the soldiers. The dead and wounded go down in scores.
Began to do terrible work among us. The most horrible blast killed and maimed dozens of our boys.
It is hell. I closed my eyes. I remembered nothing of the last struggle for the possession of the cornfield.
The field changed hands again and again.
I can't talk to him.
Eventually, Federal forces took the cornfield and held it. In 4 hours, over 8,000 men had been killed or wounded in and around the cornfield. and the battle had only just begun. The next wave of federal forces pushed into the West Woods, 5,000 soldiers in 3 massive lines.
Yeah.
But 2 fresh Confederate divisions attacked the Federals from 2 sides.
Our reinforcements arrived and charged upon the enemy, checking his advance, then driving him back with great slaughter.
My God, such confusion. All hands ran for dear life. The Rebs chased us like the devil.
In just 20 minutes of fighting, over 4,000 men were killed or wounded.
In 20 minutes.
As federal forces retreated out of the West Woods, Colonel Ezra Carman's New Jersey regiment was sent in to help. Like thousands of others in the Federal Army, Carman's men had never experienced combat. As they marched onto the battlefield, the Confederates attacked.
A hail of musketry went through the regiment, killing some, wounding many. To hold them longer under fire would be murder. I ordered them back to the East Woods.
It was not just soldiers who suffered. The confusion and horror of battle soon spread to the town. As the shelling continued, terrified civilians ran for safety, and the Krentzer family opened their home's basement to frighten neighbors.
A cannonball tore up the pavement out in front of our house. Oh, my soul. We thought we were gone.
But the battle and the killing was not over. A small sunken roadway lined with a rail fence formed a natural trench in the countryside. Some 2,200 Confederate troops waited in this sunken road for the Federal advance. The Confederates were outnumbered, but many of the attacking Federal troops had never seen battle before.
Slowly they approach up the hill. Here they are, right before us, scarce 50 yards off. They drop, stagger, and back they go. Our men reload and await for them to again approach.
In more than 3 hours of desperate fighting, the Confederates repulsed wave after wave of Federal assaults.
Within less than 5 minutes, 8 of 10 company commanders lay wounded or dead in that bloody slope. That road of death.
Finally, the Federal soldiers drove the Confederates from the lane.
Dead bodies lay 2, 3, even 5 deep. No other battle presented such a scene of carnage.
The center of the Confederate line was now broken, but the attackers had also suffered too much to deliver a decisive blow. Over 5,000 soldiers lay dead or wounded along the sunken road. A mile to the south, General Ambrose Burnside had been ordered to attack across a stone bridge over Antietam Creek.
Yep. That's his stone
Just
bridge.
500 Confederate troops held the bridge, but they were well positioned.
Forward! Rang out along the lines. We charged on the bridge. The opposite bluffs and ledges and ridge instantly lighted up with one long sheet of flame. The head of the column melted away before the murderous blast.
After hours of fighting, with 620 casualties, the Federal Army finally dislodged the Confederates.
I do not know the name of the creek, but I have named it the Creek of Death. Such a slaughter I hope to never witness again.
To Federal commanders, it seemed that one final attack could break Lee's stubborn defense. Burnside's men moved through a withering fire, surging to the southern line on a high ridge south of Sharpsburg. But at that very moment, the last piece of the Confederate Army finally arrived on the field.
A.P. Hill.
General A.P. Hill had marched his men 17 miles from Harper's Ferry. Union forces were surprised and unprepared for Hill's attack on their left flank.
The fire was pouring death upon our ranks, cutting men down at every discharge.
The whistle of the iron hail was terrible, and it did not seem possible that anyone could escape unhurt.
Another 3,200 soldiers fell in this final attack. As the day ended, so did the fighting. The Federal forces had taken the cornfield, the sunken road, and Burnside Bridge.
That was a success.
Lee's battle line was bent, but not broken. McClellan's army had also paid a heavy price.
We lay there until dusk. We had time to speculate on the impatience with which men clamor to be let into fight. The truth is, when bullets are cracking skulls like eggshells, the consuming passion in the breast of the average man is to get out of the way.
After 12 hours of brutal combat, almost 23,000 soldiers were wounded or killed. It was the bloodiest single-day battle in American history. On the evening of September 18th, the battered Confederate Army began the retreat across the Potomac, back into Virginia. McClellan pursued the Confederates, but his forces were driven back at a fort near Shepherdstown. The Maryland campaign was over. The first Confederate invasion of the North had failed. A quarter of Lee's army had been killed or wounded.
So they never made
Antietam
it
was a
into the
victory
north
for the United States,
beyond DC.
but the Federal forces also sustained heavy losses. Into the evening, surgeons toiled in makeshift hospitals, overwhelmed by the number and severity of the wounded.
There's a smell of death in the air, and the laboring surgeons are literally covered from head to foot with the blood of the sufferers.
Civilians also risked their lives to help. Clara Barton, an educator and clerk from Massachusetts, was undeterred by the bloodshed. She worked tirelessly, providing supplies and assisting the doctors.
The surgeon was sitting in one of those dark, dank rooms with his head on his hand, a picture of despair. We worked through that long, bloody night together.
Antietam made a lasting impression on Clara Barton, and 19 years later, she would establish the American Red Cross.
Founder of the Red Cross. Yes.
2 days after the battle, as Barton and others continued to tend to the wounded, Alexander Gardner, a photographer employed by Matthew Brady, arrived to document the aftermath of the battle. It was the first time in history that images of the carnage of war were captured. Gardner took over 70 photographs. A month later, Gardner's images were displayed in Matthew Brady's New York gallery in an exhibition titled The Dead of Antietam. After seeing the images, one columnist for the New York Times wrote, "Mr. Brady has done something to bring home to us the terrible reality and earnestness of war. If he has not brought bodies and laid them in our doorsteps and along the streets, he has done something very like it." Even as soldiers were being buried, residents returned to their homes to find a gruesome sight. The dying clinging to their last breath, scattered amongst hundreds of lifeless bodies who lay in fields, on doorsteps, and in kitchens.
Oh my God.
Houses were ransacked and scarred by shot and shell. The community was devastated. In the wake of battle, many felt a sense of tragedy and waste.
How many shattered hopes we buried there, none of us may ever guess. War is certainly a dreadful thing, and a battlefield an ugly blot on civilization.
But Antietam had bought something infinitely valuable. Abraham Lincoln had made his decision. 5 days after the battle, he issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation.
I determined as soon as the rebel army should be driven out of Maryland to issue a proclamation of emancipation. I am going to fulfill that promise.
On January 1st, 1863, the final version of the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect, tying the success of the federal war effort to the end of slavery. The proclamation freed enslaved people in areas in rebellion and immediately liberated some 50,000 black Americans in areas the U.S. Army controlled.
Wow.
Lincoln's order did not apply to enslaved people in the border states like Maryland, but it did allow black Americans to enlist in the federal armed forces. By 1865, nearly 200,000 had enlisted, including some Sharpsburg residents. These new soldiers and sailors provided a much-needed infusion of support for the Union war effort. The Battle of Antietam and the Emancipation Proclamation silenced talk of European recognition of the Confederacy and helped change the purpose of the Civil War. A fight to restore the Union expanded to include a struggle for the freedom of 4 million people. Antietam did not end slavery, but the battle and Lincoln's bold proclamation were pivotal steps in the continuing struggle to make the ideals of our founding documents a reality. As the American public wrestled with the changes that the Civil War had wrought, they also began to forge the memory of Antietam. After the battle, Ezra Carmen, who had led soldiers in combat and witnessed the war-torn landscape, began interviewing federal soldiers, Confederate prisoners, and local citizens. Chronicling what happened on September 17, 1862, became his life's work. In 1890, Congress established Antietam National Battlefield. Carmen was hired as a historical expert and worked with veterans to place monuments on the field, etching in stone a record of their service and loss. Through generations, people have struggled to understand the carnage and define the significance of the bloodiest day in United States history. As we contemplate its meaning, the memory of Antietam ebbs and flows like the creek for which the battle was named. Ezra Carmen expressed his memory and what this landscape meant to him on the 40th anniversary of the battle at the dedication of the 34th New York Infantry Monument.
Here was made history. Here was rolled back the first Confederate invasion of the North. On this field died human slavery. You see the same blue hills of Maryland, the same rippling Antietam carries its sparkling waters to the Potomac. But the ground is not now plowed with shot and shell and harrowed with bullets. No more is it moistened and crimsoned with human blood. Battle, death, and suffering have disappeared.
It's a good
Yeah.
movie of reenactment.
Oh my god. Why do people do this? They get themselves killed.
It's war, honey.